around too much, but since this is kind of a restoration class, and I feel like some people here are probably just starting to define their careers and find their new career paths. I have kind of a different, taken kind of a different route to wetland science than most people. So I went to college at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, and I started studying animal science because I wanted to be a veterinarian, and then it was very animal husbandry focused. It was really big into like beef market production and that sort of thing, which as I was a vegetarian at the time, it was not that exciting. So I decided to change majors, and they didn't. I wanted to find a line of work where I could work outside, and so of the majors that they had available, soil science was the one that made the most sense for me. So that's where I ended up, and so I kind of became a soil science major by default, and I really enjoyed it. It's soil science in general. You know, a lot of it has a very strong agricultural bent, but there's also a very scientific component to it as well. So I ended up more in the chemistry side of things, which I don't really apply as much now. But then out of school, my first job was at a Sequa Nipa shop. So it was not exactly field work, it was technical writing. So I did that for about a year and a half, and then through a mutual connection, I was introduced to Terry Huffman, who owns this environmental consulting firm up in Marin. Turns out, I didn't really know this at the time, Terry was one of the people who wrote the 87 delineation manual, so it was a pretty good reference. The 87 delineation manual is what the Army Corps of Engineers came out with in 1987. It was kind of the standard till about 2006 when the Corps came out with regional supplements to kind of give you more specific material that you can use for delineating wetlands. But the 87 manual is still kind of the go-to. So then Terry basically threw me out in the field and said, go map these 2,000 acres. And so that's kind of how I learned how to delineate wetlands. And then from that firm, I transitioned to a larger firm, a much larger firm called URS, which has since been acquired by AECOM, so that's where I am now. And I've been there for, it'll be 11 years this June. So it's been a minute, yeah. So, all right, so that's my intro. I figured we would talk, I introduce the concept of wetlands and wetland delineation, the United States, like the federal definition of what wetlands are, and then give a couple case studies on restoration projects that I've been involved with. So instead of starting off with picture or with a definition, I just thought I'd show you different wetland habitats. So this is a tidal salt marsh, so a tidal marsh system. As the name implies, you're connected to the ocean, you have the tides, so high salt content. In these areas, this is a nice looking marsh, so you have the main channel and then you'll have side channels that will form, and over time you'll have even more channels forming. So then there are brackish tidal marshes, so here you can see you're connected to the ocean, but here you also have a creek coming in, so you have the fresh water coming from upstream, but then you also have a saltwater influence from the ocean. So brackish systems will still have salinity, but at much lower levels or at varying levels. So that at times during high tides it could have very high salinity, but then during the winter months when you have high rainfall, you'll have more of a freshwater system. And then this is a freshwater marsh. So freshwater marshes, oftentimes these are, you'll have water for the entire year or for almost the entirety of the year. You can see really tall emergent vegetation here. So this is a system that is able to probably has water for long periods of time. Montane wet meadows. Like and I once had a debate about what a meadow is, which like one. So meadows are areas up in the mountains that have some sort of water source, and because of the high water availability, trees, which are more upland species, are not able to grow in them. So you have these areas that you will have hydric vegetation, so water-loving vegetation that grows in these. So that's why sometimes if you're up in the Sierras, you'll find these areas where there are no trees, and the reason is either if it's a natural system, it's because there's too much water and the soil is too saturated for trees to grow.
Where's that photo, yeah?
I don't know. I'm borrowing this from somebody, but it could be, looks maybe like North Tahoe or Northern California. So seasonal wetlands are areas that are saturated for part of the year. So they oftentimes, during the summer months, during our climate, which is xeric, very wet winters, very dry summers. Seasonal wetlands will be completely dry during the summertime, but during the winter they could be ponds or lakes, mini lakes. Even more ephemeral than seasonal wetlands are vernal pools, which are, they can be fairly large in size, but many vernal pools are relatively small. And these are, in California, most of the vernal pools form in areas that have a restrictive soil layer, so either a clay pan or a hard pan. And that basically this restrictive layer acts kind of like a bathtub. So the water, during high precipitation periods, the water comes in and it has no escape point. And so because of that, you get the hydric soils and you get hydric vegetation that forms. Oftentimes, vernal pools have, some of the most, I was going to say, subjectively speaking, the most beautiful vegetation around. I mean, it's very, very showy vegetation.
What's the
what
white
is
there?
who knows this?
Is that an alkaline
Who knows
soil
it?
kind of vegetation?
Oh, were you asking soil? I thought you were going to ask about the plant.
Oh, well, I was wondering if that's kind of an alkaline patch.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, that's a
Or
plant.
flowers.
Those are flowers.
Is that meadow foam?
Yeah, I thought that was flowers.
Is that the best name ever?
Yeah.
That's meadow foam.
Point-based one nicer.
Yeah. Doesn't it look like if you kind of decondition your eyes and then zoom back in, you're like, oh, there's foam all over them. That's fantastic.
So, since Lex said this is kind of a free-flowing class, one of my bosses at work tells about, who's also a botanist. He says that the botanist wanted to protect vernal pools, but since plants aren't as protected as species, they had to find a species to list. So they found vernal pool fairy shrimp. And so the botanists got together and said, oh, we need to protect the vernal pool fairy shrimp. And because of that, they were able to protect vernal pools, or start protection for vernal pools before the intrinsic value of the vernal pools themselves got protection. So anyways, little aside. I haven't verified that story, but I like to tell it.
There's work being done by Matt something, it starts with a G, from Santa Barbara, on vernal pools in Mexico, and they've discovered new species of fairy shrimp in Mexico,
Oh,
just west of Tijuana. But they're dealing with development threats between Tecate and Tijuana that are going to wipe out. They've already wiped out like 85 to 90% of the vernal pools in Mexico, but they're looking to wipe out the rest of them to connect Tecate and Tijuana. So, yeah, just he's got some interesting studies that he's publishing right now on that.
Oh man, wow! If I could get those from you through that, that'd be
I would love that.
It's, I mean, in California, we have unfortunately a very similar
Yeah.
story where most of our vernal pools in the Central Valley have gotten wiped out. In our case, it's mainly been from agriculture. So a lot of these have been plowed under. We observed this I observed this personally in 2009, I believe. We went out for field surveys in the Central Valley, and we had aerial photos that were a couple years old, and we showed up to some natural looking areas, and they've been converted to pistachios. So yeah, so that happens. Yeah, and this might be a road or a development, maybe housing. So
I was in Tejon Ranch last month, and there are vernal pools there, but cows have 100% access to every single place, even though there's a conservation easement.
yeah,
They can't keep cows out of any place. And so the cows go in there and trample everything
Yeah.
and step on it, and they can't protect even one vernal pool there.
wow, yeah.
They can't put a fence there.
That was part of their agreement.
Yeah.
Cows have the first priority, you know.
Well, so, you know, we have to, I want to be careful with cows. I'm a bovine lover, although also a vegetarian,
Mhm.
and they do a lot of positive things. They're a tool, and they're a tool in the toolbox that some people misuse, and at the same time, well-planned, seasonal munching of vernal pools is absolutely essential for many of our vernal pools. Jefferson Prairie,
Mhm.
the vernal pools out of Sacramento all have a grazing program. The trickiness is,
But there's
The
there's a
time element.
timing.
Yeah.
And Tejon Ranch doesn't have that timing element.
Right.
Yeah, it's managed. I think the key word is managed
Managed.
grazing versus full free access. So yeah, if you give cows free access to certain areas, and especially in environments where there's not that are a little more water starved, like the Northern Ranch, the cows will naturally go to areas where the water is, and vernal pools are, at least seasonally, is one of those areas. So they'll kind of focus on that area until it dries up, and they'll find the next water source.
well, and Judy was near Ling, who Jan knows from many
Mhm.
years ago. Ling actually presented a case study, and somebody else wants to explain it, more than welcome to, but if you recall, the horses were impacting the vernal pool too heavily, so one of the things they did was actually develop a spring and have a site where there was water away from the vernal pool. In addition to fencing, they were also able to create a couple of paddocks, but
Oh,
just
that's
creating
Yeah.
a source,
Mhm.
utilizing some of that water
Mhm.
and having it away from their prized resources was a very effective management tool even for that small site. So,
Yeah,
and that
that's
was
great.
Alameda. So a really neat project that Ling's worked on some great
Yeah.
stuff.
And I mean, for certain species, even though the vernal pools or the seasonal wetlands are fairly denuded, it isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, CTS, you'll find them in some of the dirtiest, California tiger salamander, you'll find them in some of the dirtiest water around. In Alameda, I took a CTS training. We went up to this, it was like a seep on a hillside that a farmer had developed into a stock pond. The water was completely brown, you couldn't see a thing. And we put a dip net in, and it was just chock full of tiger salmon.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing. Okay, alkaline seeps. So these are areas where you have high alkalinity, so high pH. Here, the salts you were talking about. So this actually is salt right there. And then also in the arid west, we have arid streams or dry washes, which are technically wetlands, but they are, because we have such a flashy system here in the arid west, you'll have these, in desert environments, you'll have these washes where you'll have water for just a very short period of time and then it'll disappear. So sometimes it's, it can be years before you have water running through these things, at least at that level. And these move quite a bit, so the channel will change year to year, so to speak. So,
John, is it true that a lot of these have underwater, they just go underground for most of the year? They actually have some degree of water flowing, it's just whatever it is, 6 feet, 10 feet underground, or has that been your experience? Because I've heard that, imagine a braided stream running underground, so it's just not evaporating.
right, You know, I don't actually know that, but that would make sense. I know they're developing, you know, a large water table in the Mojave right now. So there's definitely groundwater available, and in a lot of these systems, because the soil is so permeable, because you have these sandy soils, you know, the water drains very, very quickly, and so it really is a question of evapotranspiration rate. So if it can get into the groundwater before it evaporates, then you can build up your groundwater table. And then also slope goes through that, that would make sense. So here is the federal definition that the Corps and EPA came up with in 80 and 82 respectively. So keep in mind the Clean Water Act was passed in the late 70s by Richard Nixon, and then the Corps didn't come out with a manual until 1987. So this was a couple years before that. So wetlands are those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances do support, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. Wetlands generally include swamps, marshes, bogs, and similar areas. So this talks about vegetation that typically lives in wetlands, what we refer to as hydric vegetation, and it talks about saturated soil conditions. So the Corps came out with a delineation manual to help people in the field be able to show the existence of wetlands, and you have to show wetland hydrology, hydric soils, and hydrophytic vegetation. So those are the three criteria if you ever do wetland delineations. You have a data sheet, and you're looking for these three things. So because the easiest of these three to identify, because it's on the surface, are the plants, most people, most specialists who perform delineations are botanists by training. So oftentimes you'll have botanists who are like Lech, who are extremely good at identifying their plants. And so they'll go out there and they'll ID the plants, and then they'll check the box that says hydric soil is present. Sorry for the back.
Without digging a pit, you're saying?
So, sometimes, or they'll dig the pit and they'll, you know. The soils are tougher to identify, and the thing is that these three criteria, I don't know of many college programs that actually cover all three of these. So typically, you know, if you study botany, maybe you'll have a soil class, but it probably won't talk about hydric soils. And you know, you'll have soils 101 or something like that. And if, like me, you study soil science, I took like 2 botany classes, right? So my botany is mainly by Gestalt, or my botany is mainly done by specialists like I'll show up some more who knows their plants. So. All right, so hydrophytic vegetation. So what does that mean? These plants basically have adapted. So wetland conditions mean you have a saturated area that's saturated for a long period of time. And what that typically does during that period of time, all of the oxygen that is within the soil gets used up by the plants and the plant roots. So eventually what happens is that regular plants will die because they don't have enough oxygen for their roots and for the plant. So these plants, hydrophytic vegetation, are plants that have adapted to live in saturated conditions. So what does that mean? They'll grow certain roots called adventitious roots that are designed to find more oxygen, or they'll have other physiological changes in the plant that allow them to live in these saturated conditions. And what the Corps has done is they've created a list of plants that they know grow in wetland conditions, and they've given them rankings on how wet they are. So, so ultimately what you do if you'd see a wetland, you'd look at the plants, you'd have a plot size, and you'd figure out what your dominant species are, and then you'd look on the plant list and you'd see if they meet any of these criteria. So if they are hydric, if they're an obligate or a faculate or a facultative plant. So, and then you tally it up, and if you have a higher percentage of wetland plants and non-wetland plants, then you've met the hydric vegetation criteria. And then there are other tiebreakers as well in case we're having a hard time meeting that criteria. But
And the Arid West and Western Mountains, that's the supplement that tells you what vegetation is wetland?
so I didn't bring the map of this, but the Arid West is a region that we are in. So Arid West covers most of California, most of the coast, with the exception of Half Moon Bay, up to the Sierras. Half Moon Bay area is exempted because of the high fog. So because of that, they put Half Moon Bay into the Western Mountains. And Western Mountains, so Arid West covers California and then most of the desert states, so Nevada, Arizona. And then the Western Mountains covers higher elevation areas, and then the state of Washington and parts of Oregon as well. So between those two supplements, so I was saying like the 87 manual was the original manual, and then in 2006 they came out with these supplements. And what they did is they made the supplements more geographically relevant. So the Corps recognized that the hydrology that we have in California or in the Arid West is going to be very different from what we have in the Deep South, where we have these swamps. So the way, they don't have vernal pools out there. So vernal pools are covered in the Arid West manual, and then swamps in Georgia, they have their own manual.
Did you say the Arid West and Western Mountains? Is that the one that they produced in '87?
So these are 2006. These are two different manuals. So there's the Arid West manual, and then there's the Western Mountain Valleys and Coast Regional Supplement. Let's see. We can. Do you guys want to see a map of where these are located? Is that worth it?
Can you find these supplements online?
Yes.
And so Arid West is most of California, Western Mountains, Valleys, and Coast Regional Supplement is most of the northwest coast.
Well, who's saying Arid West includes all the other
Okay.
Okay, here we go. Here's our map.
Arizona.
I gotta do this funny
Cool.
thing.
Okay, do it.
We've got to change the screen really quickly. It's easy. It's just
Yeah, I know how to do it.
you gotta zoom out of this for a second, and then do this funny thing. Display settings.
What would I do without you?
Display settings, and then here we do. And here I want to not extend, but duplicate. Basically, what happens is that when PowerPoint takes over, it automatically grabs stuff. And now they're seeing this. So this guy,
Yes.
perfect. And then you'll be able to go back into the PowerPoint as normal.
Okay. So here, the pink area, this is the Arid West. So you can see this goes up the Central Valley, includes Nevada, and then the eastern parts of Oregon and Washington State, Idaho, and then all the way over here to so Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, even some of Colorado, western Colorado, Wyoming. Wow, the Great Basin in Wyoming. And then these mountain regions. So here you have the Continental Divide. Here you have the Pacific Crest, and then you have the Cascades and the coastal range. Those are covered by the Western Mountain Valleys and Coast. And then here we see the Atlantic and Gulf Coast plain. And then there's also an Alaska-specific manual, which is good because 40% of that state is considered wetlands. So they do their own manual. And then Great Plains, Midwest, North and Central, and then Eastern. And with the 87 manual, it covered all of these areas, and it was not as specific on criteria. So the Corps realized that they had to give better information that was more regionally relevant. So that's what they came up with in 86. So now when you go into the field, you carry two manuals with you. And the data sheet is also, the criteria are a little tougher to go through, and They're meant to be more scientific and more relevant. All right. Now I'm going to try to jump back. How do I jump back?
The easiest way is just to,
Minimize that.
if you know. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Boom. All right. Okay, hydric soil criterion. So a soil that formed under conditions of saturation, flooding, or ponding long enough during the growing season to develop anaerobic conditions in the upper part. Okay, so what does that mean? What happens in I'm going to try to keep this fairly big picture. Most soils, 95% of soils are considered mineral, so that means their parent material is decomposed rock. And then about 5% of soils is organic. And so organic soils, those are areas where, you know, in bogs or such, where you have a large amount of areas that are saturated, usually for the entirety of the year or almost the entirety of the year. And what happens is we have vegetation, emergent vegetation that's there, plant matter decomposes, and then it starts building up. So you have decomposed plant matter, but because of the saturation, it can't decompose all the way. So you have a buildup of almost decomposed plant material. So regionally where we had this was in the delta. The delta used to be a giant swamp before it got drained and turned into agricultural land. There was a huge buildup of organic matter. So a cautionary tale, why is most of the delta at elevations below water level? Because what they've done is they've drained these organic soils. As a result, all this organic matter started oxidizing and the land started subsiding. So after they built the levees and they drained the soil, all the soil started subsiding. So that's why we have these major subsidence issues in the delta. And we're still flooding.
What is the typical soil organic matter content of hydric soils? If it's usually 5%.
Oh, so you mean for organic soils or for mineral soils?
Organic soils.
For organic soils, it can be at a minimum 40%
Okay.
organic content. And then, yeah, I think around 40 is probably the lower end, and then it can go up to 100%. But the majority of soils are mineral soils. And so these are decomposed rock material. And then when these areas get saturated for long periods of time, what we'll see is you'll see reduction in oxidation. So redox features are what we're looking for. So oxidation, that's when you see this reddish material here. So this is basically metal oxides that what happens when the soil becomes reduced is these metals can actually move in solution. They go towards the roots or they clump together. And then when the soil is drained, they become oxidized. So you see these little rust stains, and that's called oxidation. And then the other side of that is reduction, when you see the soil become extremely gray in color. Grayish, so it tends towards gray. So if your upland soil will be very vibrant in color, and then if you go down into the depression and you see the hydric soil, it will be much more gray in color. And that's the reduction. So basically what the Corps has done is they've come up with these field indicators. So that means things you can see in the field that are positive indicators that this soil has changed as a result of being saturated for longer periods of time. And then the hydrology criteria that we need. So the important thing is that we need a minimum of 14 consecutive days of saturation. So hydrology criterion here, lands that are inundated or saturated to within the majority of the root zone for 14 consecutive days during the growing season. So 14 days translates to 5% of the growing season, depending on the length of your growing season. But that translates into 14 days. So here's an example, during the summer, the area can be really dry. During the spring, it's completely flooded, and in the fall, it's green. Okay, and so basically, from a more scientific approach, we talk about perennial and seasonal wetlands. So the perennials, we've already seen some examples. So we have marshes, we have the saltwater marsh, the freshwater marsh, the brackish marsh. And then seasonal wetlands, we have the wet meadows, the seasonal wetlands, vernal pools, and seeps, and then the washes. So that's wetland delineation in a nutshell. So that's really, really, really condensed wetland delineation. But like suggested, I start with that before we talk about restoration projects.
And Jan has co-taught the 3-day or the 5-day on this?
So I teach the hydric soils and the field portion of a 5-day wetland class at San Francisco State University Extension. And then a former coworker of mine is now a professor at USF, and she actually has a program through their environmental studies masters, where she teaches wetland courses in a sufficient quantity of them for people to get a wetland professional training certification through Society of Wetland Scientists. So, and that leads up to a professional wetland scientist certification, which you can get if you have wetland background plus at least 5 years of experience in the field of wetland science. So it's a pretty innovative thing. So those are, I've been teaching the San Francisco State Extension since like 07, I think. But anyways, soil scientists are hard to find, so they're like, please teach the soils.
What is a swamp considered a marsh, or is
Well,
what is a swamp?
is a swamp considered
Or
a
is
marsh?
a swamp not a technical?
I guess you could. I would
I'm just-
put swamp into freshwater marsh. I'm sure there's when I think of swamp, I'm not going to be able to give you the technical definition, but when I think of swamp, I think of it having trees. So, the freshwater marshes here are mainly, emergent plants, so leafy plants that are erect, but they're not, aside from willows and alders, we don't have too many trees out here that grow in wetland conditions. And so, we could definitely add swamp to this list.
Are these California?
This is not a comprehensive list. These are just things areas, sorts of wetlands that you may see more adapted to here. It's not an extensive list, and the Corps doesn't have a list that says all wetlands will fall into these categories. So what the Corps does have is they have criteria to say whether you are in a wetland or not, but they don't limit you to certain categories of wetland types. So oftentimes because there's no vegetation manual for vegetation types that the Corps or federal or state agencies use as the manual for vegetation for delineations, most wetland scientists follow their own guidelines. So there's no overall, there are plenty of really good manuals that talk about wetland vegetation in the context of other vegetation habitats, but there's no specific one that the Corps will use and say you need to group all your wetlands into these different habitat types.
In the manual of California vegetation, if you remember from earlier on, that has some nice wetland vegetation associations, but that one's only obviously California specific. But I feel like that's something that I've become comfortable with when I talk about wetlands. I'll talk about 2 or 3 of the dominant species and kind of give it that moniker, give it that title. MCD is, it's Killer Wolf and Julie Evans, and who else is on it? I think there's a 3rd author on it.
And a lot of people will reference that, but it's not a requirement. So because of that, I think some people will just come up with their own, descriptors. But that is definitely a good one to reference.
So there's no sure thing to say like what's facultative wetland versus allocative?
No, there is a plant list. So there is a definitive core plant list, but there's no list for wetland habitat types. So what Lek was referring to is a manual that talks about the different vegetative communities. So there's nothing on the community level. Basically what the Corps has is they have, so the core vegetation list, and here, let's pull up a sheet. Uh-oh, Lek, I'm gonna make you jump again.
No, it's okay. Oh, it's good. It didn't
Are
flip
we
back
good?
automatically.
Okay,
So
but it doesn't
everything
give
you're
me
doing is
Chrome
being
either.
watched, so be careful.
Oh.
Be very careful. Okay.
If they can't hear us, they can't see it.
Not that page.
And by facultative versus obligative, what would that be considered?
The way the Corps had grouped it is that obligate. So here you see obligate, fac wet, and facultative, and then there's fac up and upland. Those were the 5 categories. So obligate means that 99% of the time the plant will occur in a wetland. Fac wet means 99 through 66% of the time. Facultative means somewhere between 66 and 33. So facultative is that intermediate point, and then fac upland means 1 to 33% of the time, and then upland means less than 1% of the time it will occur in wetlands.
Could you say those 3 terms again?
Sure. So it's OBL is obligate.
It has to be.
So obligate means it has to be, and fac wet is FACW, and then fac is facultative, and then there's fac up and upland, and what they also have. So you have the prevalence index here, and then in the hydrology section, they have the fac neutral test down here. You see D5, and what this means is when you take out the facultative species, if you have more obligate or fac wet species than you have fac up or upland species, then you can use that as a criteria as a secondary indicator of hydrology. And if you have 2 secondary indicators, that is equivalent to a primary indicator.
So sorry, it's facultative wet is 66 to 99%, and then
Yes.
36 to 66%.
So 65 to 33 or so is the facultative.
Okay.
And according to Bob Holland, who I guess was on this committee, pretty much the way they group these plants is a bunch of botanists sat down and they're like, oh, I see this one in wetlands all the time. We're going to call this obligate. Oh, this one's pretty wet. We'll put that into fac wet. So it wasn't like they were in a lab and they put plants in water and determined what the threshold was. It was basically they took the best experts that they had and they asked them to come up with this criteria. But so what the Corps does, the Corps definition here, they're doing more of a presence absence. The community is more of a qualitative analysis of what you have present. It's still quantitative, but the Corps has had a hard time moving from quantitative to qualitative. And when it comes to mitigation, that's where qualitative kind of plays in a little bit more. But what this data sheet is meant to do is be a presence absence data sheet. So just to define whether or not wetlands occur or they don't occur. So they're not going to treat, this data sheet is not going to treat a perennial marsh different than a vernal pool. You should still be able to meet the criteria on the data sheet. But what the Corps has done is they've divided this into 4 different strata. So you have the tree strata, and so then here you can see the plot size. So the tree strata, because trees grow tall, the plot size is much bigger. Sapling and shrub strata, so that means woody vine. Actually they have a woody vine strata, then sapling shrub, and then herb strata. So in California, oftentimes, if you're not in a riparian habitat, most of your plants will end up in the herb strata. But then with each of these, you would figure out what your dominant species are. You'd map your plot size, and then based on the plot size, you would take your absolute cover, your percent absolute cover of each species, and then based on that percentage, you would determine whether it's a dominant species or not, and then you would give it an indicator status. Then what you end up doing is over here you see the dominance test worksheet. You take all of your dominants, and here you see total number of dominant species that are obligate, FAC, wet, and FAC, and then you divide it by the total number of dominant species across all strata, and if you're greater than 50%, then you meet your hydric soil criteria.
Another question. If I remember correctly, sometimes is it true that some sites don't have the same species in the same category as obligated versus FAC wet? Like I know one site we had a ranunculus that was facultative, but on another site it was tried as FAC wetland. Is
The same species of plant.
yeah.
In different, so for the different areas, so arid west versus western mountains, some species are given different indicator status in the different areas. So let's see. The plant list is now digital. So this is where you go now for your indicator. So status. Okay.
Not what you expected out of an army
I know, that's
website,
what
huh?
I'm-
Yeah.
Obama's really changed our country into a soft place.
I know. Yeah, the Army Corps. It was really so. So ultimately, as far as the law is concerned, the EPA has the ultimate call with wetlands, but the EPA in general is more. They're more into policy, and so they needed someone to actually do the enforcement. So they went to the Army Corps and they said, "Hey, come up with this manual and verify these delineations." And so that's what the Corps does, but the EPA still has veto power, which they can use, but don't do that often. But
So they have veto power?
they do. So the they can review delineations and then confirm them or not confirm them. I'm drawing a blank right now because
This guy over here? Plant list?
so those are the plant lists. There used to be just a spot where you put in the plant species name and then
like a little finder.
yeah. Side map. Homepage, mapper tool. Homepage is going to take me right back to where I am. Okay. So here's a 2016 plant list, 2016 updates.
Did you say all this was part of the Clean Water Act that was passed under President Nixon in '74?
Yes. So it all stems from the Clean Water Act, which
Okay.
I've recently learned there was an act before the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Water Act just amended that act. But that's neither here nor there. Species updates. So somewhere in this very well-designed website, search for species. Here we go.
It's Trump. He redesigned the website.
At least he left it up. He's removed a lot of things. Here we have the Army Corps logo.
Well, they had to remove everything that was related to climate change from
This
all
looks-
sites.
This is awesome. Wetland ratings. Oh, wetland ratings also brought to you by the Army Corps. Oh, this is a mobile tool. That's why I'm striking out. Okay. So I got.
Oh, so they might have like an app that
Yeah,
you
see
can
here,
use?
John, is the search, was that one marking the search for species?
Oh,
Or were you already?
he pressed
No,
one.
I was in the mobile tool.
He pressed one.
Do they have an app?
That could be.
Yeah.
Could be. You can still. Okay, this is good. Linnaeus is here. That I associate him with. I associate. No. It's actually.
That man is there. He's there for
They used to
now.
have. I obviously haven't checked this list in a while. Oh, here it is. Look, search species. Okay. So name a species.
Ranunculus. Let's check out wireless ranunculus.
Oh, look at all the ranunculi. Which one?
Do you remember?
Let's go Californicus because that's where we are. Okay, and so here this shows you the range. So right here, this area got highlighted, and then I'm trying to scroll down, and here. Okay, so here you see arid west. So that's AW's arid west. So it's back up in the arid west, and then the western mountains, valleys, it's FAC. So yes, a species can have a different indicator status.
For us, we were at a Redwood National Park, and in that site, it was counted as like fact wetland, and then like down the way a little in a different park, it was counted as facultative, and it was just like within
Okay.
5 miles away.
Interesting. That strikes me as a mistake. So,
Really?
well, I mean,
It
both,
could be right on the border.
it could be right on the border. Did they explain why they gave it a different indicator status, or did they just?
No, he
No.
just said that it seemed that the ranunculus in one part of it would grow more towards the water, whereas the other one more upland. And that's why they classified. He counted that as more facultative. The other one more fact wetland.
Okay, so this sounds like a case of best professional judgment, where somebody came in and decided that the plant in one area looked like it was more hydric than in another area, but typically that's not done.
Okay.
So you can, if it, how would I say this? If you're in an area that is clearly a wetland, but you're not meeting the field indicators, then as a wetland scientist, you can make a note and say, look, this area is clearly a wetland, and this is why I think it's a wetland. And it could be that some of these field indicators aren't capable of showing that this is a wetland area. But then you have to lay out your case why you think that is happening. So for instance, in certain soils, you're not going to see redoxymorphic features because the chemistry isn't there. There aren't enough metal oxides in the soil, so even though the soil is reduced, you can't send it to lab, and you can't see these indicators that you're supposed to see in the field. But then you would say, based on the vegetation and based on the fact that I see the hydrology here and I know this area is saturated for more than 14 or 18 days during the year, I'm going to assume the presence of hydric soils. But I've never heard that done with a plant, especially so close together. So that would be, that seems like somebody made a call. But technically, this is how the Corps sees it.
Okay. That's why I want to go site specific.
Yeah. But that being said, like the boundaries are not that clearly defined. So I once asked the Corps if they could give me the boundary for the little snippet in the arid west. Let's see. So we couldn't really see it on our map, but there's like just the little tiny spot around Half Moon Bay that is part of the Western Mountains, and they wouldn't tell me where the physical boundary is where that occurs. So. I had a project I was working on the Devil's Slide, so on the tunnel that Caltrans was building, and it's right at that boundary. So it was, so we could have used either data form because it was, from the map that they provide, which is at that scale, it's literally like a third of an 8.5 by 11. That's the scale that you need to use to determine whether or not you're in the arid west or in the western mountains.
So when you had that big map, when they had that coastal, when the mountains going down, you said it ended around the slide? Because I thought it was more in Mendocino, I thought it was higher up.
That's interesting. I would presume they have a shapefile for this somewhere, but maybe they don't want to
I
There it
think
is.
they did. They didn't share it. Okay. Area list.
And are these boundaries based on soil types of the regions?
They're based mainly on climate.
We just had it right there. See,
So,
the mountains looks higher than
right,
the sun.
but do you see right here where this pointer is?
No, I don't see that.
Okay, there is
My
just
glasses
a
aren't big
little.
Press that button.
There we go. Thank you. So you can. So right there, if you look closely, you'll see that there's just a little sliver of green. You might have to actually go up physically to see it, or you can
Okay.
take my word for it.
So
But
right
there's just
wow.
that little sliver right there. So it's south of San Francisco on down a little bit, but
Little things like that.
And it's not the Santa Cruz Mountains.
it is. I think that probably encompasses the Santa
Yeah.
Cruz Mountains.
Oh, it
That's,
is.
that
It is.
includes
Oh.
Half Moon Bay.
Oh,
So this is the rain shadow, so this is some of where some of the wettest, down in Big Sur, I'm sure that was question, they decided where to include that, but some of the wettest weather, I mean, we have rain events, precip events here that are 1 inch in there, they're 15.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so it's just on a different scale. I imagine this map was really difficult to make, but looking at the precision, I mean, some of these, it looks like there's actually in this area, there's the desert mountains, and then there's
Yeah.
the Great Plains, and then it transitions over to arid west. And
Mhm.
You think this was done off of aerial plus some site work? How would they? Or they would just be measuring temperature and rainfall?
I would say they probably did it off of aerials. Like a lot of NRCS soils maps are done from aerials, and then there's some field verification involved, but most of the work is probably done from aerial photos.
How do they do that through aerials doing soil type, like, is it through, I mean, do they figure out whether it's like a mollisol through aerials?
What they do is they look at the topography,
Yeah.
so, and then they know that so if you, let's say you have a hillside, and they know that the soils on the side of the hill are going to be much more shallow, and then you have the toe slope, and then you have more of the valley, and so they would probably go out at some point, dig soil test pits, and then look at that area on an aerial image, and then on a scale of what, like 1 to 20,000 or something like that, then they would determine, okay, well, this valley here is very proximate to that valley here. And then also looking at geology maps, this is the same parent material as this area, so we'll probably all, hillside slopes we'll call, this type of soil, and all the valley soils we'll call this sort of soil. And then they also, for the soil map units, then they also say, well, this map unit will include 20% of this soil type and 20% of that soil type, and usually they'll, if it's in a valley or so, they'll have like a 5% for a wetland for hybrid soil type as well. So, it's not a very precise scale, and a lot of the background is that a lot of the the soil manuals were were made for agriculture, so farmers could go out and see what sort of soils they have in these areas. So that was kind of the genesis of those.
I was gonna, in order to keep this moving also,
Yeah.
because we're excited about that, I was also gonna say on CalFlora, when you search, I believe they give you the determination of the plant in terms of its wetland status.
That's right.
So they
That's
will
true.
tell you
Mhm.
stacked up.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little box that pops up, which is convenient. So.
But did you determine that there was a wetland at Double Slide?
There are a lot of wetlands in Devil's Slide.
Like at where the valley?
In the valley, yes.
Okay.
Is that the right one there? Oh no.
Just keep-
Okay, this is good. So, Devil's Slide, just what you had there, most of the wetlands at Devil's Slide were seeps. So there were a few drainages coming down, fed by seeps. There was a large stock pond that was full of red-legged frog. And then one of the drainages, there had been a few, they'd actually created a pond for red-legged frog habitat as well. And then there were some seasonal wetlands, but they were mainly seeps. And then after they bored through the hillside, the hydrology changed. So some of these seeps dried out. And they weren't quite, they weren't quite sure how. I mean, they know why, but they're not quite sure how.
Did they do any mitigation then, or?
Yes.
for the
So,
red-legged frogs?
I could have brought that one. Caltrans bought a parcel that they call the chart house site. So if you guys know where Montera is, so
Yeah.
if you go through the slide and then you come down, and on your right hand side there is a restaurant right next to currently it's a Peruvian restaurant, but it used to be called the Chart House. And that across the street from there is a parcel that Caltrans bought, and then they did some significant grading, and they actually they graded a seasonal wetland, they graded it a little bit too deep, so it became more of a perennial wetland, and the success is that they actually had red-legged frog population that started there.
Okay.
So, but then there were other lessons learned for other things. Yeah,
So it's right across from the restaurant?
it is. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
The parcel of land.
Yeah.
The restaurant's really good. Yeah.
There's
Outdoor fire pits. And
yeah, I've never been to that one, but they have several other ones.
Oh, yeah. Highly recommend it.
And the view is phenomenal. Yeah. But yeah, right across the street, there's a little drainage right there, and then there's like blackberry bushes, and there used to be an entrance. Now they've taken it out. But if you look over into it's a lot of wetland. And I mean it kind of goes around a corner as well. So they've created several wetland areas. So this is one of the two case studies that I wanted to talk about. Is the client is Eco Services. This is known as a Peyton Slough remediation project. This is a Martinez Benicia Bridge. So basically that's 680 right here. This is 680, and this is a Carquinez Strait in here, and this is where the bridge goes over, and then right in here, this is the
Sorry, I'm not seeing.
Sorry,
I'm
Jan,
not seeing-
the pointer's not showing up.
the pointer. Oh no.
I have a pointer.
All right.
Hold on.
Oh yes.
If you press the wrong button, it's a black light.
Okay.
Over here,
I'm
isn't
warning
it
you.
over here?
It's a front
Oh,
one,
wow.
the back one.
Okay.
For the party.
So I'll try to be as stable as possible. So this is the Martinez Benicia Bridge. This is Highway 680. Here, Walnut Creek is down here. This is the marsh up here. This is Peyton. This is a North Marsh. This is the client. So they're a chemical company. They're located right here. This road is called Mountain Mococo Road, which is an acronym of sorts for Mountain Copper Company, which was the historic owner. Mountain Copper Company, they worked with copper, and they threw their waste material into this marsh. So they had 2 or 3 big piles. One pile's over here, and then here, along here was a slough, and they just threw a lot of their waste material in here. This is the South Marsh in here. And this is McNabney Marsh, which is co-owned by East Bay Regional Park District and Mount View Sanitary District. Over here you can see some sanitary ponds. And then here you can see a lot of refineries. So this is like Refinery Row. All right.
Where's the town of Martinez in relationship?
Town of Martinez is right in here.
Okay.
Right in here, and then there's housing all along here as well. This is Waterfront Road right here, which is subsiding. We'll get into that. All right.
2 of the 4 big refineries in the Bay Area right here.
Shell. This is Shell right here. This is
Valero?
Valero.
Is it Valero?
This is Valero. And then here you can see these docks. The Laro, they have a dock right out here. I think you'll see it on the next image or the one after. So this is from overhead. Again, this is an eco services facility. This is the North Marsh area. This is Zinc Hill. That's McNabney Marsh over here. South Marsh here. So we'll get into the details a little bit. This is the historic slough. This here is the new slough. Here's the tie gate. And then this is a regional location, so we are right here. Here's the Benicia Martinez Bridge. Here's the city of Martinez. Here's Benicia over here. Green areas indicate wetlands. You'll see the Carquina Strait is a pinch point, and so water moves through here very quickly. Highly erosive environment. Here you can see these white caps. This is from boats coming through. These are docks. So you have some really large tanker vessels coming through. I think these are the mothball fleet out here, the Old Navy fleet. Sassoon Bay is up here, so that's Sassoon Slough, right up there. And here's the bridge off of Highway 80. So, kind of reference. All right. So what happened? So company used to be called Rhodia, so this is why this says Rhodia facility. They bought this from Mountain Copper Company. Mountain Copper Company, these red areas, these were dredge piles or spoil piles. These were full of really high contaminated waste. Eventually what happened is the Regional Water Quality Control Board sent them an order that they needed to clean this area. So there was a lot of testing done. They found elevated levels of copper and zinc, and then there were these spoils piles. And so what they did is they excavated a new slough using this already existing drainage over here. So they decided to take this slough and move it over here away from the contamination. So that's what the new slough looks like. There were some side channels dug to help with the tidal flow. And they removed this side cast material here. A lot of this was placed into the old slough. They put a clay layer in the bottom of the old slough, and they put a lot of this dredge material in here. They looked into removing all of the material off site, but I think the cost of that would have been $200 or $300 million. So that was somewhat cost prohibitive. And then they capped the old slough with clean bay mud, and then they restored the disturbed areas. So if you look at imagery, this is September 2004. Here you can see the old slough channel, and here you can see the spoil pile area, and that area is here. So this is now overgrown with emergent vegetation. This is all tidal marsh now. And then here is the new slough. And then here, this is what we call the bulkhead. So at the edge of here, they put wooden piles to keep this area from eroding. And they put some riprap out here as well to protect that area.
So all the toxic material is still in the same location in the marsh?
Some of it is. Some of it is.
Oh, they took some of it out?
They took some of it out,
Oh, okay.
but a lot of it is in here. They have monitoring wells along here, and they need to report to the regional board on a regular basis to make sure that the water that's discharging out of this area meets regional board standards.
Mhm.
But yes, a lot of material is in place,
Mhm.
and we'll get, at the time that seemed like the best solution. So it's the onus of the cleanup was on the landowner, right? So they bought the land, they knew it was contaminated, but they bought it in the 60s, before the Clean Water Act, before these regulations came out, right? So it's hard to factor in those sort of costs.
I have a question. Who did the actual excavating? Was it AECOM got a contract?
So we got the contract for the design. The company that did the actual excavation, I believe, is Dutra. So I don't have any good construction pictures here, which is a shame. But yeah, they full suite of heavy equipment out there. So a lot of excavators, backhoes, what have you. So they.
So did you say that they used clay to kind of seal off the
Right.
the toxic materials?
Yeah, so they created an impermeable layer so that material is stuck in place. And then they lowered the elevation of that material so that they could put clean fill on top. So this area now, as you can see here, it's covered with emergent vegetation. So
So it's like it's a cap of, the place to keep it from being permeable, and then the cap is green so that if there's a lot of vegetation, it's not cycling back out.
exactly, right.
A question about what surveys you did, because there was a slew there for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, and you're just making a new one. But what are the things you surveyed to make sure that you're not missing out? I mean, I know you do mountain surveys.
Yeah. So there was a 10-year monitoring plan, which went from 1996 through 2006. Surveys, so the success criteria included vegetation, obviously. We did sedimentation rates. We did bathymetry of the channel, so we would go in the channel and measure the elevations of the channel. We looked at the, so I'm going to draw a blank on the technical term, but we looked at the small critters that live down there. So the benthic survey. Yeah.
Are those the little insects or
Mhm. Right. And then also some fish surveys. So, and we're actually continuing surveys. So there's some more work coming up. Yeah.
So you were doing surveys for a long time before it was done, so you have a lot of data then.
Yes.
So that's really good.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
because there could be a drought or there could be
Sure.
a rainy year, and so you can look at different years.
Right. And then this year was obviously very atypical. And so this you know, the Peyton Slough and the marsh here is part of a larger watershed, and there are complicating issues that I'm going to get into a little bit. So right now, one issue that we're dealing with that was not foreseen in 1996 is that we have shoreline erosion, and as I mentioned before, we're in the Carquinez Strait. It's a very erosive environment, but the other factor now is that for about 100 years or so, there was a lot of sediment coming into the bay as a result of gold mining, and that sediment load is now ending. So there's now a shortage of sediment material coming in. So I think here's the figure. So you can see in 1928, this is the extent of the marsh. So the marsh vegetation went to about here, and these were all mudflats. And so over time, the marsh grew out this way, and now in the last 10 years, we've lost about 20 feet of marsh. So the marsh is now starting to recede.
So that scale-wise, show us again what 20 feet is, about this much.
So I think the yellow is probably the maximum extent. That says 1980. So 2009 is this red.
Okay.
And what's the blue? The blue is 2000. And so now we're somewhere closer to here.
So you had two years of a lot of rain. Last 2 years.
Yes. But this was over. So we had some of our monitoring stations were right along, were placed about 10 feet from the shoreline or so, and we've lost those stations. Those are completely gone, right? So, yeah.
So that's since 1980?
2006 was when monitoring started.
Okay. So in 10 years, 20 feet.
10 years, 20 feet. Mm-hmm.
And the sediment was just washing down from the Sierras, from the gold mines?
Yes. So there was just
From the platinum.
and I think USGS figured out the that the sediment wasn't coming down at that rate sometime maybe in the last 5 years or so. So it's kind of after the fact they're like, whoa, what's, you know, oh, it looks like we don't have the sediment rate that we used to have. So now we have this cap material here, and the shoreline is eroding. So that, you know, long term, you know, the next round of challenges for this client is dealing with sea level rise. Then in '96, this seemed like a good solution, and the slough itself is functioning very well. But
Can you talk a little bit about when you have established channels in this type of a wetland? I'm thinking of like a braided stream that moves a fair amount with different events. Do these channels move much over the course of time? Do you have new channel formation, or is it a pretty stable system?
we have had new channels form. So let's see, going back to this figure, there were a couple cross channels cut in here with the intent that that would move water through and that extra channels would form here. We've had smaller channels forming in here. So what this doesn't show is there are a couple cross channels here. Those are called the mosquito ditches that the mosquito vector district put in, probably around 1920 or so. Let's see if I have a good image of that. Here. You can see these channels here. The mosquito vector district put these in. So we had a head cut right there, where at this corner there was a new channel forming that was going towards the bulkhead. So there was maintenance done to keep that from occurring because we didn't want a channel to go through this area. And then there was another channel going across here. But over here you can see that these channels form a more dendritic sort of channel system. This channel isn't going to change much. I mean, this is a large channel that got dug out. The hope is that channels will form off of this and then channels will form off of those. So the North Marsh here this is tidal, and then here you have the tide gate, and then here you have South Marsh, which is muted tidal because the full tidal action only comes in when we open the tide gate. Problem with that is that this is waterfront road, which is subsiding. There are flooding issues on that road. Tide gates were supposed to be operated by Mosquito Vector District. They've walked away from the tide gates. So now Eco Services is operating these tide gates. So and then here's McNabney Marsh, which Mountain View Sanitary District and East Bay Regional Park District manage. Their vision of what they want this to be, of kind of a muted tidal marsh area, is also tough to do because their marsh is also subsided. So they'd have to bring in a ton of bay mud in order to bring that up to the proper elevation. So there are a lot of birders out here. They want to see a wide variety of waterfowl. They don't want it to be a lake or a pond. So that means that the tide gates have to be closed. Part of our mitigation was that we wanted to have pickleweed growing in here, pickleweed established, so we need to flood that at a certain point. So we have monthly calls on how to operate the tide gates, and there's no long-term solution in place yet. So these are all things like when you're working on a large mitigation project, oftentimes you have multiple stakeholders, and kind of a take-home lesson is you need to get all those stakeholders to the table, and you need to put in writing what everybody's going to do, and you have to have some sort of enforcement mechanism. So.
Do you have those little salt marsh mice that are endangered there?
This is considered salt marsh harvest mouse habitat. I think they occur in McNabney Marsh, so they've been documented in McNabney. They have not been documented in Rhodium Marsh.
So when you did that big survey for over 10 years, you weren't seeing those little mice?
That's correct. We did do bird surveys for rail, because this is also a clapper rail habitat. There were no clapper rails found, so Jules Evans, who's basically the Bay Area clapper rail expert, came out and found lots of black rail, but which is a California sensitive species, but no clapper rail.
question with the tide gates. Are the tide gates closed to keep the area flooded, like the tide comes in, or it's to monitor the, is it, how is it?
So the tide gate, the way it functions now is that you can close the gate, you can lower it to a certain extent, or you can designate the elevation, so you can lower it a bit or lower it very far down. So during the winter, the tide gates are closed to keep flooding out. But the water can get out, but it can't get in when the tide gates are closed. And then for the South Marsh, the other thing is that water moving between McNabney Marsh and South Marsh goes through a culvert right here that goes underneath the railroad. Another constituent, the railroad company here. They have this is called railroad culvert. So there's a culvert that goes through here that's undersized. So because that culvert is undersized, it takes a long time for water to move from South Marsh into McNabney Marsh and a long time for water to drain out of McNabney Marsh. So what that affords Eco Services is that they can open the tide gate and they can flood the South Marsh because the water can't back up into McNabney Marsh fast enough. So the South Marsh will flood, and that has helped to establish good piggle breeding. Now another issue is you have nesting birds in McNabney Marsh. So during nesting bird season, oftentimes we're not allowed to open the tide gate. So that's kind of the situation we're in now, where McNabney Marsh was extremely flooded during the winter, but now it's very, very dry because the tide gates have been closed for such a long period of time. So a lot of challenges.
And being that you guys, I mean, with the future and climate change and rising sea levels and all that sort of stuff and the shoreline eroding, are you taking into account 30, 40 years down the road of what's going to happen with rising sea levels and the flooding in the Strait area and McNabney Marsh and all that sort of stuff? Is that something that you guys are looking forward to now?
Yeah,
but looking forward to in terms of planning, but not looking forward to.
Yes, so basically the 10 years of permits have run out.
Okay.
And so the client is now going for the next round of permits because there's still work that needs to be done. So, you know, the ideal situation here, big picture, talking to our hydrologist, would have been not to have tide gates at all. Because when you have a structure, then you have to maintain that structure, right? So, Mosquito Vector wanted the tide gates. They were over on the old one, they moved them to the new one. If you didn't have the tide gates, you wouldn't have to worry about that sort of structure. But in terms of permitting, both the Corps and BCDC have requested a sea level rise adaptation plan. So we're looking at this area and adjusting for sea level rise.
Was the Army Corps of Engineers doing a lot of work to forecast the sea rise along both coasts of the United States in the past?
I don't know.
So you do your own studies?
The onus is on the applicant to do the study.
Okay.
So most of these agencies, they may do a large-scale study. So BCDC has a sea level rise. They've requested sea level rise charts for the entire bay, but when they ask for permit application, they request that the applicant perform a sea level rise study. So these are, so basically for the shoreline, these are all different types of alternatives that you can use to riprap. So riprap gets used in a lot of areas. If I went back to the Carquinez Strait figure, you'd see that especially in areas where you have, you know, the towns of Benicia, for instance, there's riprap all along the shoreline. It is fairly effective in terms of reducing erosion, but it doesn't provide very good habitat. So
do folks know what riprap is?
No.
riprap is rock slope protection.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
So basically rock material that gets put along the shoreline. So if you go along in San Francisco, for instance, if you walk along the bay, you'll see large
Big
piles
rocks,
of
not,
big
not
rocks,
little rocks, big rocks.
big ones. Yeah. This might be a little bit too dense, but these are all different things that BCDC wanted us to look at and say, well, if you're going to use riprap, look at these different alternatives first. Let's see, we're about 5:20. So I'm going to, well, first, are there any questions on that project? All right. So the other project that I'm going to highlight, very different environment. This is out in Livermore. This is for LARPD, the Livermore Area Recreation and Parks Department. So they run parks throughout the city of Livermore, is what they do. And most of them are playgrounds, sort of parks. But Livermore also has had some very large developments. And one of the developments, for mitigation, what happened is a parcel was deeded to LARPD as mitigation for the development of a housing community. And that was this property, the Garaventa Wetlands Preserve. So they were given this property about 10 years ago, and they haven't, and it's basically been more or less sitting there. They haven't developed it or done anything with the parcel. They own it, but they haven't done anything. The whitish area is the growth boundary of the city of Livermore. So you can see this is just within the growth boundary. Out here is an area known as Frick Lake, which is an ephemeral lake. That has a known California tiger salamander population. This is what the parcel looks like. So what you can see here is there's a large drainage that goes through the site right here. And then down here is a manipulated creek that is run by the flood control district.
You said manipulated?
Yes. So I think it's manipulated as part of a housing development, but it basically has perennial flows, water flows. At this point, I think it may have to do with the golf course, that they have enough. You know this area better than I do. But
Is this zone 7 you're
Yeah.
talking about? Yeah. And I don't want to misspeak on it either, but this area, the Livermore Valley historically was a rich, dynamic wetland area. The Mount Diablo to the north, the Hamilton Range to the south. And in this area there was Alameda Creek went through. And Alameda Creek oftentimes got a lot of water, and there would be a tremendous amount of flooding. So Zone 7 is a special district that was put together to try and come up with a plan to mitigate impact of flooding to predominant property. And so I think that might be the safest definition I'm going to give you without overstepping my technical knowledge. But they control flows, they introduced additional channels, have ponds where water may sit for a while, and just generally change quite a bit of the hydrology. But there are tastes of intact hydrology, such as this site. Or wetland.
yeah, there's actually pretty good habitat right here on Zone 7. But then right down here, there's a creek. So
That's not in it. You're
no.
outside the boundary.
So here's the school. Then right here, this area right here is where this perennial creek runs through. But this is our parcel here. So this shows you our parcels right there, the Garaventa Wetlands. This is a Springtown area. So this is from CNPS. This is a CNPS figure. So this up here is Los Vaqueros watershed. That's the East Bay Regional Park District. Basically, what Springtown is it's a giant sink. So a lot of water comes into the Springtown area. You have a lot of the mountains around here are marine sediments, and so you have a high concentration of minerals. They're very erosive, and so during rain events, a lot of alkaline material comes into the Springtown area. And then here, the red is alkali soils that are extirpated, and then the yellow are the ones that are still extant. And so you can see we're right on the boundary. These are all housing. Red is all housing developments basically here, and then you can see what's left of the Springtown alkali.
And for folks that have heard of Springtown proper, which is arguably the most interesting botanical area in the East Bay, it is predominantly this area, and you saw the creek running through. So these are very similar areas, botanically speaking, and this is a general outline of areas that the authors of this publication thought were extremely important for conservation, and in particular, these are the upper watersheds going down, and then this is the bottom of the watershed.
Can you put the Springtown again? It was just next to the houses.
Sure,
there.
it's just Springtown is this little
Okay.
indent here where there was an initial interest to develop it, and it was refuted.
A lot of rare species.
Can you
or just
just give a very quick something about what makes it so special?
Oh boy. How much time do you
I
have?
think I have
quick.
a couple slides.
Oh,
So
here you go. Yeah,
ecological
yeah.
significance.
Awesome.
So we have, Springtown, we have an incredible suite of rare birds, mammals, amphibians that live in the alkali ecosystem. You have about a dozen federally protected plants. I think I took out the slides on the here common species, so western pond turtle, red-legged frog. Here you saw the California tiger salamander, and then here are some of the plant species that are here: condens, tar plant, brittle scale. And then I took out the slide with the Springtown. Wasn't there a Springtown tar plant?
Birdsby.
Birdsby.
But there is also the newest state-listed endangered plant exists, is completely localized to this range. It's called Livermore tar plant, or
That's right.
some people like to call it Livermore moonshine, and it is a beautiful tar plant, and it's completely limited to this area. So.
There's great native bees that are all on the little sort of sandy rise there, and they come out to pollinate little, what are they, little purple veil looking things. They come out, they're obligate pollinators, they need that guy, they need that guy. They're only,
Down in GS.
they're beautiful little flowery and white.
Well, the city of Livermore adopted the Livermore tar plant as their flower for Livermore. So,
Oh,
yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
So here is just a quick description of alkali sinks. So you have the erosion of the marine shales and the sandstone that provides the fine sediment and the salts that comes from up in the Altamont Pass area. And then you have higher evaporation rates than you have precipitation rates. And so as a result of that, a lot of these minerals get brought up to the surface. When the water evaporates, it brings these salts up with it, and so you have oftentimes an alkali crust that forms. So this was a picture from the site. You can see how white that material is. That is not meadowfoam. Those are salts. And those lead to alkali soils and these alkali scalds. So in the scalds, the scalded areas are the ones where it is the mineral content is too great for vegetation to grow there. Even for, all these plants here are adapted to highly alkali environments, but in the scalds, it is too concentrated for even those plants to survive. And then here are the we went over this a little bit. So here, vernal pool fairy shrimp, California tiger salamanders typically lived in vernal pools, and with the loss of vernal pool habitat in California, much of their habitat has disappeared. So now one of their primary habitat sources are stock ponds. Okay. So this was what the site looked like in the spring and summer of 2015. Here you can see some of the salt scalded areas. Here you can see a drainage. You can see how cracked the soil is. That's an indicator of hydrology if you were to do wetland delineation. So the cracked soils oftentimes indicate that you had a lot of moisture and then it dried out. And then here you can see this green vegetation that runs along this drainage. And here there's a little outcropping. You have a good view from up there. This hill is very contentious. There's a housing development that's slated to go in here, and the neighbors have fought it. So far, they formed a coalition called Save Our Hill. It's very popular with the dog walkers, so they really like this area, and they fought out the first round of the EIR, but I think there's a second EIR coming out. So, anyways.
So is Garavanta just the bottom but not the hill?
The hill has a different name. So
But it's not part of the 21.4 acres? No. So Garaventa was named after the family that owned the parcel, the Garaventa family, and that was a parcel that was deeded. So this parcel LARPD owns. So there's so it is protected, but the development would be just on the other side of that fence from the Garaventa residence. And then here is the hydrology in the January of 2014. So Livermore, again, very ephemeral system. I don't know if you remember January 2016. Before January 2017, January 2016 seemed like a really big year. But well, there were 45 days with no rain, though, from mid-January to mid-February 2016.
This was beginning of January, yeah.
So it was
and then it was
still raining.
This was what it looked like after the last of the big rains.
Mm-hmm.
So
nice.
Here's that drainage that we looked at that goes through the parcel.
Mm-hmm.
And then this was what our wetland delineation showed. So here's Altamont Creek that we were talking about. And then here we have this nice main drainage that goes through here that ultimately drains down into Altamont Creek. And then we have a series of different vernal pools and alkali swales that occurred on the parcel. So we worked with LARPD, and we were trying to figure out how to turn this into an open space preserve that would at the same time protect as much habitat as possible, but also open the area up. Because one of the issues that we were dealing with that was that the local kids were using this area as their BMX park. So they were building BMX ramps. I think I took the slide out, but it was in right I think like right in here, right next to this big wetland there was a series of jumps that they built. Yeah. Oh yeah.
They love it to ride their bikes there.
Totally. Yeah, it's flat, and there's no housing, so you can, exactly. So
No motorcycles in there?
well, this one's a little harder to get to than Springtown. The thing with Springtown is a lot of houses back up on Springtown, and so people go out there, I think, with their motorcycles as well, but also BMX. Here you have Vasco Road, which is a very busy road right here, and then you have kind of this creek blocking it off over here, and then the hill right there, and then this is privately owned. So this is a little more difficult to get to. There's no access from this side. There's a street over here from the school, so you can come up that way. So it's a little tougher to get to than Springtown. So I think because of that, it's not quite as heavily used as the Springtown area is.
Did they build them a bike or a skate park? Because they have their bikes in there. Did they get a skate park in the city?
I am not sure if the city of Livermore has a skate park.
Or I mean, after the the back, like if they're trying to preserve it to get them
Yeah.
out.
No, that would be a good idea, and but I'm not sure if they've come to that conclusion. LARPD, you know, like it's a district that gets funding from local taxes, so they have a set amount of funding. From what I know about the organization, most of their development is geared towards. I mean, they run like I think they run like a swimming pool, and they have different playgrounds. It's a park and rec.
Ball
Yeah.
fields.
Mm-hmm. So I think a skate park would fit into their vision more so than this, but I don't know if they came to that conclusion. The ones who, you know, this parcel, because it's never been developed, the people who really pay attention to this are the rangers, and so they, you know, there's some open space rangers out there. They're the ones who kind of maintain this area. But yeah, I don't know if there's any momentum for a skate park. That would seem like a sensible solution. It's probably a funding issue as well. So this is what we found out there during survey. So here's the Downingia you were talking about. We found a bunch of western pond turtles in right in here. There's a large culvert that goes underneath the street, and right in here. So technically just off the site. Our herpetologist found a bunch of pond turtles. He's very excited.
Boy or girl?
Boy.
They're all these boys.
Yeah, I don't see them.
That's not out.
But
Says
there's
that
no,
out, but he doesn't have
there's no
it on the
stubble.
modeling.
Yeah. Looks kind of
And what's the
crazy.
plant again? You said Downingia?
Downingia.
That means you Pichellas.
So the bees that pollinate these can only pollinate these guys, these one species, and the flower needs these bees, it's an pollinator. Find out the beauty of
So this was the design we came up with. We figured we'd put in a boardwalk that would go around most of the wetlands, and then these would be observation decks right here. This was an access gate so that you could still, the LARPD could still access this area if they needed to do any sort of access work or any maintenance work out there. Part of the issue, we were looking for grant funding for this. Part of the issue was getting access to this parcel. So we thought initially, we brainstormed about putting in a parking lot maybe up here or down here, but that would have triggered a lot of environmental review, and you know, then you were starting to pave areas. So we quickly took that off the table. And then the other issue with this access route here is that you're crossing over the creek, and if you were to put in a bridge, well, first off, they don't own this land, and then if you put in a bridge, then you go through another round of permitting, water quality permitting. So, so we didn't really want to do that. There's an established access route here that Zone 7 owns, so they came up with a mutual use agreement with Zone 7 because the city and LA, or Zone 7 and LARPD have a mutual use agreement. So that was the preferred route, was either coming from here, from Black Oak Court, or coming from over here. Part of the issue would be signage, how to get people, you know, to know that they can park here along the road and then come all the way over here. So.
And remember, in the context of what Tanner talked about a couple weeks ago with permits, you know, trying to minimize them, and even though this would provide restoration and recreational opportunity, putting something like a parking lot in there or a bridge would still be subject to development permits and require likely an individual permit as well as all the other good stuff, and suddenly this becomes a 5-year project for permits.
So to put a bridge in here, you'd need at least 3 permits. You'd need an Army Corps of Engineers permit, a Regional Water Quality and Control Board permit, waste discharge permit, and a CDFW lake and stream alteration agreement. So the core permit doesn't, you don't have to pay a fee with it, but with the regional board permit and the CDFW permit, you have to pay a fee. Plus you have to pay the consultant to write the permit. So you're looking at at least 20,000 to write those 3 permits.
Yeah.
So
And there's not a permit needed for the construction of the boardwalk? It's just not, doesn't count because it's.
so those permits you need if you're going to fill a wetland. The way the boardwalk was designed was that there was not going to be any fill of the wetlands, so there are 3 wetland crossings. There's one here, one there, and one there. And so here's a more of a close-up picture. But in order to avoid impacts or to minimize impacts, what we were thinking of doing was using something called diamond piers. So they use these in wetland areas or in marshes. This is basically like a cement block. Only about 1/3 of it is underground, and then you basically hammer in these stakes.
Tell me I'm the
Right. And then, so we would put those on either side of the wetland and then build the boardwalk over the top of the wetlands in order to avoid fill. So this was a potential boardwalk design, and then here you can see here the diamond piers down there, and then you go on top. All right, and then, so this project is still pending, and
Any grant funding?
not
out
yet.
there?
So we, no, so we're still looking for grant funding. So we haven't heard back from this year yet. But last year we put into this year's bid.
So that was a picture of another wetland with the board?
Yeah, this was
Oh.
a potential boardwalk design. So this was not. This was these were. This was a presentation that I did. Well, there were 2. There was one for the board, LARPD board, and then one for residents in the city of Livermore. So this was to show them what the boardwalk could potentially.
And where's that at?
This is I think this might be Alviso. So it's down in the South Bay.
Where do you solicit funding? Who do you go to for funding?
So for this one in particular, there was a land and water conservation fund grant that we were looking into. The grant source that people right now in the water world really like in California is Prop 1 because it's such a huge grant and it's divvied up into basically it's Prop 1 is $7.2 billion. So this was a state. It was when was this voted on? 2014 or so, I believe. It was a ballot initiative,
Right.
and then the voter approved. So some of the money goes towards water storage. Some of the money for Prop 1 goes towards restoration, and some of it goes towards stormwater cleanup.
Sort of the drought, one inspired by the drought issues.
The drought inspired the water storage portion of Prop 1, which I think is about $3 billion. So they're looking at raising certain dams. So existing dams, they want to raise certain dams to increase storage. They're looking at a Sykes Dam or Sykes Reservoir is a conceptual reservoir. They're basically building a dam outside of a drainage. So they would build just a giant reservoir and then the water would get sent to Sykes Reservoir instead of building, typically dams are built on watersheds, right? So the goal here would be that they'd be avoiding a lot of the pitfalls of building in watersheds by having an off-site water storage facility.
Where would that be located?
It's if you go up like 505, it would be I think Colusa County, somewhere around there. So it's not near anything in terms of large cities. but it would be the northern valley.
I was wondering, a couple minutes left. We might end on time for this. Dare I say that? One of my interests is always thinking about if we develop something, do we have the technology, the knowledge, the confidence, and the experience to reproduce certain types of ecosystems with function and vegetation? Wetlands have been, in particular vernal pools, seem to be one of the toughest systems to restore. And I wonder, as we look at this area, and if you were to swing back to the Springtown slide really quickly.
Yeah.
Oops, go the wrong way. Yeah, even this larger overview. You know, I always wonder, so there's always an interest in developing up here. There's vineyards, ideas, all sorts of ideas. You can see these parcels, people that have very large parcels that don't have a whole lot of, they're cash strapped. All their life is in there, is in the land now, and there's a real big interest to develop some of these parcels, including some of these more alkaline ones, and those development proposals pop up fairly regularly. What's your feeling on the little that you know, the amount that you experience this kind of alkaline system, and particularly, you know, knowing Springtown and the areas around it? Do we have any ability and knowledge to really restore pools in this area?
Restoration as a field is still developing. So I went to Society of Ecological Restoration in California, SoCal. There's a conference every year. I went there. I went on a field trip on Friday. We looked at tidal marshes. So we went out on Highway 37. We went to the Sonoma Marsh, which was a core tidal wetland project that was put in place about 20 years ago. And then right next door was a new tidal restoration project that was put in place about 2 years ago. And so when you look at the design, the differences they've done, they've learned a lot over the last 100 years. A system like this is, I think, a little bit more complicated. I think something like this will be very difficult to restore. So preservation is really key in these sort of environments. That, you know, the problem with vernal pools, especially when you get into chemistry, when you try to recreate the chemistry, creating the conditions that form that chemistry in the first place, you know, that's very difficult to do. I mean, in this area, it took hundreds of thousands of years for that chemistry to form. And then to try to do that during a 5 or 10 year monitoring period is, you know, is a tall order, frankly. So yeah, I think restoring vernal pools or alkaline vernal pools is very difficult. And, you know, vernal pools oftentimes, if you dig too deep, it becomes a pond. If you don't dig deep enough, you know, you're not going to have a long enough hydro period. If you don't create the correct impervious surface, if you don't use the right material for that, it could be porous and water will not pond. So, and you also have to keep in mind that a lot of these restoration projects, they're large scale. You know, you're coming in with large equipment. So it's like, okay, well, we're going to put this half-acre vernal pool over here, and we're going to use this pile of clay material from over there. It's not like you're shoveling in clay material and you're, you know, texturing it along the way. You have like this giant pile of material that you stored up, and that's going to be your impervious layer. And so who knows, maybe there's a sand lens in there somewhere, and because of that, you basically have a drain in your bathroom. So it's very difficult. Restoration there's a lot that goes into a successful restoration project, and there are still many lessons being learned. So, in general, you know, what we try to tell our clients is, you know, first and foremost, try to avoid impacting areas as much as possible. Then, if you can't avoid them altogether, try to minimize impacts, and then finally mitigate. So, you know, in case of roadway construction, Caltrans, they're engineers, they're trying to design the road as straight as possible. And then sometimes you have to say, well, you know, maybe we can route the road around this area. And so it's good to have, it's good to, you know, be able to be part of the process at an early stage so we can help develop it properly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.